All right, good afternoon, good morning for anyone joining from the West Coast, good evening for anyone I might have left out. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Brian Berger with BMC Software. I am a Footprints account manager, also a product specialist here on the BMC side. I definitely want to take a quick minute to introduce you to RJR Innovations. They are one of our premier partners and a great resource for anyone looking to migrate from the old Footprints platform version 11.6 to the new version 20 platform, and we're going to be covering some information on that today. RJR is great for that purpose, as well as general training, optimization of the system. My associate Nick Room is going to handle the webcast today. I'm going to go ahead and monitor the chat. If you have any questions, please include those in chat, and I'll make sure we get those answered for you by the end of the day. And thanks so much for joining us today. Nick, I'll leave it with you.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone. So switch over here to sort of what my main introduction slide was. So like Brian mentioned, thank you for joining today. You'll see sort of like the slide here is done in an interesting way, session 8A here. We host a monthly Footprints administration webinar series geared for the current version of Footprints. So, if you're on version 11, not super useful, but we do have a series where we have webinars once a month on the second Wednesday of the month generally. And so our prior session that was on June 14th did talk about transitioning from 11 to 12. BMC then, approached us and said, hey, could we do sort of a more in-depth version of that webinar? So that's sort of what this is here. We're going to have, I have a series of slides for you guys. I'm going to cover that for about 20 minutes. Then I'm going to segue into some presentations where I have various Footprints environments to show you, what the different approaches are. And then we're going to have some Q&A at the end. By all means, anytime you have questions, ask them in the chat the moment you get them. And between Brian and a couple other people here, monitoring them if there's anything we need to tackle right away, or if not, at the end there. Okay, so about RJR Innovations, I'm a consultant, not a sales guy, so I always kind of hate promoting this part here, but we are a premier partner of BMC, like Brian mentioned. We've been working with BMC since 2004, which of course predates Footprints, and been working very much in depth with Footprints since 2012, since BMC acquired Numera Software. We specialize in ITSM and ITAM and a couple other facets as well. Quickly kind of go over this, so on our prior webinar, which was the one here at the beginning of June, just, a couple of the topics that we covered. All of our webinars, including this one here, are recorded and available at rjrinnovations.com/webinars. Usually takes a couple of days, for our marketing guy to sort of finesse the video and then upload it. But if you want to catch any of the prior sessions that we've talked about, again, they're pretty much only geared to the current version of Footprints, but there's lots of useful information there. As well, if you're interested, the next session is going to be in July. You can see the topics that we're going to be covering there and the registration link on the screen, which I will try at some point in the webinar here to put in chat so you can just copy paste instead of having to type it out. So in order to get started, I'd like to set the stage. What is the situation, right? So the first thing I think I have to point is that going from Footprints 11 or prior, if you're on an earlier version, to the current version, which, it used to be Footprints 12. BMC has now switched the versioning system into a yearly system. So, the current version is 20.23 for the year, .01 for the first release of the year. So that's the current version, but it's not an upgrade. So I think that's the first thing I have to make abundantly clear is that it's not like, when you upgraded from 11.3 to 11.6 or from 11.6.01 to 11.6.02 or something like that, right? This is really like a transition. This is like going to a new product, except that new product essentially you already own, right? And it has a lot of the same fundamentals as your current product. And we'll get into some of those comparisons in the next few slides. I'd also like to mention here, you don't have to buy it, right? You get like-for-like licenses. The way licensing is handled from a technical standpoint is also a little bit different. So that's why I'm saying, you get free like-for-like licenses. It's also a lot nicer. If any of you guys here on the call have installed FootPrints 11 prior, from scratch, whether it's spinning up a new test system, a new training system, whatever, the first thing you have to do is put in that challenge string, put a call into BMC support, get the response, and it's a huge kind of pain that doesn't exist anymore. Given that this is a transition from one software to the next, essentially, I say this to all the clients I've worked with, whether they're going from 11 to current version, or track it to FootPrints, or some other tool to FootPrints, this is the perfect time to review and improve your processes, especially with FootPrints 11 clients that we've talked to. Oftentimes, the scenario is we implemented FootPrints, half a decade or more ago. We haven't really done much with it since. And, there's a lot of things we wish we would do differently, but, either we don't because we don't have the time, or our admin no longer is with us, whatever the case may be. So whenever you're transitioning from one software to the next, it's the perfect time to review your processes. There's 3 ways to accomplish this transition, and I'll cover all those 3 different ways in this presentation. A typical transition takes about 1 to 3 weeks. So again, trying to set the stage, set the expectations, right? Typical transition, 1 to 3 weeks, depending, there's lots of variables depending on which approach you want to take, depending on, do you need data to come over, depending on how complicated your logic is, depending on, do you want to review and change your processes, things like that. And I've mentioned there specifically excluding training. The new version of FootPrints, or new quote unquote, it's been out for almost 10 years. The current version of FootPrints is so different in terms of administration from the old version that you really do have to take training. And that training is typically 5 days. But don't worry. So a few things to mention here. So FootPrints 11 is still fully supported. Now, I do put a little asterisk here, and this is my own little disclosure here. I have a screenshot from the BMC support page there that does show, for example, 11.6.15 as full support. I do have to clarify that a little bit in that although BMC calls it full support, BMC's definition of full support also includes feature improvements to the product line. And version 11 has not had any feature improvements aside from maintaining third-party support. They haven't done any feature improvements since version 12 came out in 2014, but otherwise still fully supported. BMC has also indicated they don't have plans at the moment to end of life the version 11 Arch, so long as there's a significant number of customers that are still using it. Now, of course, as customers transition from 11 to the later version, eventually they are going to stop supporting it, but that's not going to be anytime soon. And we also, expect that we're going to get, we and you, everyone is going to get a noticeable heads up as to when that EOL will be. When you transition, your support contract carries over, so you don't have to, renew your licenses, differently. You don't have to, pay extra or whatever the case. It's all, seamlessly transitioned over. Okay, so into some of the differences. So I've organized this, 11 and prior on the left, version 12 and later on the right. And then I'm going to have sort of different rows showing up for some of the key differences. So the very first one is just the way it's coded. So version 12 and later, version 12 was a complete rewrite from the ground up of the application. It wasn't a major improvement or anything like that. It was a complete rewrite. And they went from Perl to Java. In terms of requirements, although they're somewhat similar, they are a little bit different as well. For version 11 and prior, if you're running it on Windows, well, it would run on IIS. Whereas the current version runs on Tomcat, regardless of whether you're on Windows or Linux. A few less options for SQL for database support. There's no MySQL, there's no Oracle. Essentially, you get to choose between SQL if you're doing Windows or Postgres if you're doing Linux. I did put a little asterisk on the Postgres one here because one of the transition methods that we're going to be talking about is the FootPrints Advanced Starter template, which is not available for Postgres. Containerization. So the concept of containerization still exists. And in version 11, you essentially had fewer options. You workspaces, address books, CMDBs. With the current version, they've thrown in a few others. Service portfolios, which is primarily going to be for service catalogs and SLAs, which in version 11 and prior was done sort of within the individual workspaces. And then knowledge base as a separate one. So, we always kind of used to say version 11 has a knowledge base, which in my humble opinion is not true. It doesn't have an actual knowledge base. It has like a way for you to apply tickets of knowledge. But here we have an actual knowledge base. Workspaces are also quite a bit different. You're used to a single workspace is a single type of ticket, and you can only be in one workspace at a time, right? If you want to switch from one workspace to the next, you go to the top right of your screen, you hit the little drop down, you switch workspaces. Now, workspaces, first of all, can have multiple items within them. So a workspace now is almost like a quote unquote super workspace, which of course is something that doesn't exist here, but it's a workspace can have multiple items, and those items are more like workspaces that you're used to. So the terminology is shifted a layer a little bit here. And that also allows you to work in multiple workspaces at the same time. So you don't have to, close everything down for you to switch from incident to change. You can work with both of them side by side. User interface, big change here. Version 11 and prior did not have a configurable user interface. Sure, you could add some widgets, you could create some saved searches, but that's it. Whereas 12 and later is a completely configurable user interface. Forms. So each workspace has a single form, and that form is used for agents and customers alike. And that sometimes complicates your design. You have to make sure that fields are in the right place so you don't end up with gaps and things like that. Now we have two separate forms, one for agents and one for customers. Publishing. So with version 11 and prior, the moment you hit save on a change, whether it's saving your form, saving an escalation rule, etc., the change is live right away. Whereas now we have a concept of publishing. So you can make all the changes that you want. And then when you hit that publish button, that's when they commit to the live environment. So the big benefit here is if you have lots of changes to do, you might be thinking, I've got 3 or 4 hours of work ahead of me. Feel free to do that work. For the most part, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, in the middle of the day while everyone is using the system. And then when you get to your maintenance window at the end of the day, then you can hit that publish. It takes that 5 minutes or whatever the case may be, and then you're done, right? So you don't have to be doing those 3 or 4 hours, in the middle of the night. Business logic also changed. So version 11 and prior, business logic was strewn throughout a bunch of different places that, if I'm being honest, is not standard. Instacalc, escalation, auto assignment, etc. Now it's all tied into, the sort of standard business rules. And then lastly, solutions. So I kind of mentioned that one before. Solutions was just like a ticket that was flagged as a solution. Now there's a separate container type, separate workspace knowledge base for that. In terms of similarities, so things that hasn't really changed. So people, the way people interact with FootPrints, you have agents, customers, and contacts. It's the same principle here. License type also the same, named and concurrent. The way you design your form is also the same. So what you see is what you get. Style of editor, click and drag, add your fields, your columns, your sections, etc. But one key difference here is with version 11 and prior, if you remove a field from the form, you're deleting that field. And also deleting that column in the database. That's not the case anymore. If you remove a field from the form, it's still there. And there's plenty of use cases for that, like business logic and reporting. Surveys. Surveys still exist and function very much the same, but instead of being sort of a separate workspace, it's now an item within a workspace. There are still workspace templates, although not as many, from 20 down to 7. But unless you're building from scratch, that's really sort of a non-issue. Global tickets still exist and still function pretty much the same way. But because of the nature of the new version of FootPrints, where you can work with multiple workspaces at the same time, the usability of globals isn't as critical anymore, right? A lot of people will say, I use a global incident ticket as my problem ticket because it's simpler than having this with workspace. That doesn't exist anymore, so we just don't use the global for something like that. Containerization. So things are a little bit more segmented here. You used to, for example, if you go into workspace administration, you can administrate your users from there. Now, for example, users is maintained at the system level, but everything else in terms of how records are handled and permissions is the same. Okay, so looking at the different methods to transition. So we got three, out of the box, the assisted migration offering, and the FootPrints advanced starter template. So out of the box is basically probably like the exact same way you set up FootPrints to begin with, right? You install FootPrints, you build your environment from scratch. You might use some of those templates to get you started, but otherwise you're building it entirely from the ground up. The beauty there is you can, have it configured to your exact requirements. Of course, the downside is you have to build it. Next up is the Amigo tools, the assisted migration offerings. This is probably the ones you've heard the most of, and is generally, or at least was, BMC's standard approach. And they essentially built a set of tools that you would run onto your version 11 environment, and it would download your configurations and your data, package it up, and then you can then run that package on a version 12 or later environment and load it up. And then the last method, the FootPrints advanced starter template. This is our general preferred approach, and BMC's preferred approach anytime they're talking to a client that is new to FootPrints. And it's essentially a pre-configured environment with over 20 different processes, incident problem change, purchase management, project management, preventive maintenance, etc., sort of all ready to go out of the box. Okay, so high-level steps on how you transition to the different methods. So again, same sort of tables here. So out of the box, very kind of easy. You install it, you gather your requirements for your design, you build it, you test it, you modify it, you test it again, you modify it, you test it again. You do that a bunch of times until you're happy with it, then you go live. With Amigo, you run the advisor and export tools on your version 11 system. So there's two tools. There's an advisor tool, which will give you essentially sort of like a checklist of things to be aware of and things that you have to do. You then have the export tool, which will do that export of your configuration and data and package it up. There's then a separate import tool to run to import that into the current environment, the current version of FootPrints. You then have to complete the configurations because the Amigo tools won't do everything for you. And it's kind of what I've enumerated there in step 7. There's plenty of things that Amigo won't do for you. For example, if you're using service catalog or knowledge base or surveys or CMDB, it won't migrate that. So that's still stuff that you have to do yourself. It will migrate your workspaces and your business logic, your escalation rules, your instacounts and all that. But you then have to review those business logic and either tweak them to correct them or at the very least just turn them on. And like I mentioned before, there was no configurable user interface in version 11 and prior. So of course the Amigo tools won't build you a UI. You have to do that yourself. And then lastly, the FootPrints advanced starter template, essentially you install it and then you can review the processes that you want to use, make some minor configuration changes if you need, load up your own category tree, things of that nature, and then away you go. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the different methods. So again, so out of the box, I'm going to show you a FootPrints environment, current version of FootPrints, what it would look like if you just did a fresh install. Going to look a little bit at the business processes and then quickly look at creating a workspace. So you have a little bit of an idea of what that looks like. And especially, when it comes to like creating a workspace, I'm showing it to you here for the out of the box. It's going to be the same thing for Amigo or for Fast, right? Creating a workspace in FootPrints, the current version of FootPrints, is the same regardless of which approach you take to get there. With the Amigo tools, I'm going to quickly show what running the advisor looks like, show you what the report looks like, show you what the export looks like. I'm going to kind of briefly show you the import, but of course the import, like in my environment here, the import takes about a half hour to run. So I'm not going to go through that that part there, but I do have it run in an environment, so I'll show you what it looks like afterwards. And then also going to show you the FootPrints Advanced Starter template and give you a little bit of a intro to the service desk container. So I'm going to switch gears to presenting now. If there's any questions that you have, again, feel free to use that chat or that Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to my VMs here. Okay, so the first one is the out-of-the-box approach. So I've got a couple different virtual machines up here. So in this virtual machine here, I've got the latest version of FootPrints installed. It's a fresh install. Nothing's been done to it. So the first time I log into it, and I'm just kind of doing this to even here show, is it's going to ask me to load my license. Now, remember I said this was one of those differences from version 11 where you had that challenge string that you absolutely had to communicate with BMC support for. Here, you'll have your license file, which is an XML file. So I load my license and away I go. And I can load that same license for as many instances of FootPrints that I want. Of course, your EULA, your user agreement, states that you can only have one production environment, but you can have unlimited number of non-production environments, test, dev, QA, training, whatever you want to call it. And it's all from the same license file. So here is a blank environment of FootPrints, logged in as an administrator. I can go to my administration section. You can see these tiles over here. These tiles over here are what we call container types. So I can have workspace containers, I can have address book containers, CMDBs, right? You're familiar with those from version 11. Here's the two new ones, but you can see in each one of them, there are no containers that exist out of the box. Now I can run some templates, right? Which they call them business process here. So I could run a template to say, hey, I want an IT service management, right? I want an ITSM sort of a template to be launched. And here's what it's going to do. It's going to create a workspace called Service Desk, another workspace called Change, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go through running this because this takes about 5 to 10 minutes to run, but it would create those containers for you, similar to how the templates worked in version 11. More than likely, you're going to have to make some changes to those containers because it might configure things not the way you want or not completely, things of that nature. Now, outside of these containers, we do have ancillary things to configure on the left-hand side. I'm not going to go through all of them, but for example, configuring my users, configuring my user interface, things like email, things of that nature, which are not part of the containers. If I were to create a new workspace, I hit my create button over here. I can give it a name, first workspace, hit create, and this is going to create a workspace. Not to be, not the same thing as a workspace in version 11. Like I mentioned earlier, this would be more like, if I could call it this way, a super workspace, right? Once this gets created here, I'm going to have a single item within that workspace, and that item is going to be more like the equivalent of a workspace that you're used to. So I have my item over here. I can have relationships between that one workspace or another, et cetera, email templates. When I go into this ticket, this is now where I have my forms, right? I told you there was two forms, the agent form, the customer form. You edit this the same way you would have in version 11 and prior. So that's a quick intro there for, creating a workspace. I'm not going to go through, everything here, especially because, there are no business rules, there's no workflows, there's no templates, et cetera. You have to build it from the ground up. So next up, I'm going to show you the Amigo approach. So I'm going to switch over to this virtual machine here. So I have, version 11 over here, which I'm going to log in real quick. Now, there's not much going on here. I've got, I think, like 5 or 6 workspaces, maybe like, half a dozen tickets in total. This is a very simple test environment here, right? So you can see I've got a few different workspaces here. And couple tickets. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the Amigo tools. So the Amigo tools are separate downloads you get from BMC. BMC does have a knowledge article for that. It's actually pretty hard to find though. So your best bet is to contact your support provider and ask them for the tools. The tools are specific to a target version of FootPrints. So for example, this advisor tool is specific to the version 2023-01 of FootPrints. If you're planning on going to a different version of FootPrints, you will have to get a different set of these tools. So I got the advisor tool and the export tool, both of them extracted over here. So if I run the advisor tool, and this one I can do, I think it takes like a minute or so to run here, so I can talk while it goes through. So this is basically going to check your version 11 environment and give you a report of things to be aware of for this transition. So first thing you got to do is point it to your version of FootPrints, version 11 of FootPrints. There you go, and run it. Now I have a very, like I said, very simple environment, just a few workspaces, practically no tickets. So this is going to run pretty quick for me. Yours might vary, depending on the amount of workspaces and tickets that you have. Once this run, it spits out essentially an HTML report. Now, what I'm going to do, just in the interest of time, it might take another few minutes here, but I've already run this a few times, so I'll show you where it spits this out. So if I go into my FootPrints 11 folder, I then have this new folder here called Migration Advisor Reports. And then within it, you'll have some files. Now I have a lot of files because you can see, I've run this a bunch of times. I ran it here. Oops, I ran it here. I ran it again on the 29th, on the 7th, and then again here. So if I open up this one here, this is going to open up the report once Firefox is done installing its updates. Always at the most opportune time. Okay, so here's the report. Now, the first thing you'll kind of get is a little table here that gives you some timelines as to expect for doing the export and the import. So you can see, separate times for the import, separate time for the import. And that'll also depend based on whether you're doing configuration or data only. Mine's pretty much the same, because like I said, I think I've got like a half dozen tickets here. Setting expectations, especially if you've been using FootPrints for years and years, you expect a half day to a full day for this process to run. Now, next up, we then have essentially, here's like issues detected in your environment, right? And then some generic issues. You can expand on each one of these and look at them. Now, most of these are just informational. Like for example, this one here, right? Well, there's no social media integration in the current version of FootPrint. So the whole Twitter concept doesn't exist anymore. Form drafts will not be migrated. Shouldn't be an issue because they're drafts. Now, if you're in the middle of working on something, finish doing whatever you're doing, save your draft, save your form, and then away you go, right? But it basically gives you all of these things to look at, and then some of them, like the first section, specific to your environment, and then some of these here more generic. Now, there is a hefty list to this. Don't be too overwhelmed. A lot of these are fairly basic, like, hey, APM doesn't exist. No one used APM to begin with, so not a big deal. BMC does have on their documentation, if you go to the FootPrints documentation, they also have a whole section of the admin guide that talks about this and provides more information. And it might even be linked somewhere in here. I don't remember anymore. So that's what this report here does. Now you can run this report like I did in the environment in the middle of the day while everyone's using the system. It doesn't require any downtime. And then it also kind of gives you, some checklist of things to do and whatnot that you can look at this. I strongly advise, especially if you're going this route here, work with a consulting partner, such as ourselves, Flycast, whoever your partner is. Work with a partner, because this is a lot of work and a lot of complex things to account for to do on your own. And unless you're a very expert administrator working in your environment day in and day out, this might be too much, for you guys to do, right? In line with what I mentioned earlier, this is not an upgrade, this is a transition. Once the advisor is done, right, the next step in the process is to run the export tool. Now, the export tool, I'll run it again as well, but I'll probably sort of skip to the end here because it takes a few minutes to run as well. Similar kind of interface here. This also, like the advisor, does not impact your data. So in theory, you can run this one while people are using the system, but I would recommend not. Now, there is a fairly noticeable warning when you run this. I'll get to it in a couple screens here. And we did some checking and it's not, an issue. This right here, you can pretty much ignore this, right? It's not going to do any kind of destructive changes to your environment, but usually the expectation is people are going to be running this when they're ready to transition. So this is really just here in place to say, okay, at this point, this is the point where you should stop using version 11, because if you keep using version 11, any new tickets or changes that you make will not be part of this export, which means you'd probably have to run an export again. And the exports are not cumulative, right? You can't just, export the deltas, so to speak. So this is going to run through and okay, it's done already. Look at that. It's going to build an export package of my environment. Oh no, sorry, it's not. Few minutes. So configuration only or configuration data. What workspaces do you want to bring over? So you might have some test workspaces. Hey, I don't want to bring over these two over here. And then there we go. Now, that's also going to export into your FootPrints 11 environment into Migration. It builds these packages. Now, these packages are not, super big, but of course, my environment's pretty much empty. You would then take this package and copy it over to your new server where the new version of FootPrints is. You then run the import utility. The import utility is part of the new version of FootPrints. I'm not going to go through and run it because again, it takes like over a half hour to run, but it's basically right in here. You run this, you point it to that backup package that the exporter did, and it imports. Now, what that looks like in the final version, I'm going to log in here. Now, this is not a blank environment that I ran the Amigo tools into. This is actually a FootPrints Advanced Starter template environment that I then ran Amigo into. So there's going to be a lot of extra workspaces in here that were not part of the Amigo tools, but I'll point those out so that you can see really just what Amigo did. And I'm going to go back over here. Actually, let's go to, so I'm in my service desk workspace. I'm going to go into workspace administration, and I'll try to do a little bit of a side-by-side comparison here. Now, things are going to be a little bit slow because I am running all of this off of my local machine here on these different VMs. So just bear with me when things are a little slow. So workspace administration for service desk, if I go to form designer, for example, this is the part I kind of like to start off with, right? So you can see what the form looks like, the different sections that I have on here. I ran this using one of the templates, and I don't think I really made any changes to this. But you get the idea. And then what that looks like on the new version, is to come up. Once it decides Tomcat is started. Yes, please. Okay, so it is slowly getting there. There we go. Remind me later. Okay, so you can see here compared to the out of the box one where there was no workspaces right out of the box. With Fast, there are a bunch, or with Amigo, right? So if I go into here, you can see a bunch of workspaces here, but the only ones to concern yourselves with are going to be these ones over here from when I ran the Amigo process, the Amigo import. It recreated these workspaces, right? Service desk problem change, right? That's these ones over here, right? It recreated those ones. So if I go into the service desk one, into incident, you can see it's configured my form pretty much to look the same as what I had before. it's also configured some business logic for me. Now, all of these rules, whenever it does this business logic, all of these rules are not active by default. You do have to go into each one of these, verify the functionality, and then turn them on. So that is a little bit of an extra step there, but it gives you an idea of the process, right? And those business rules, this business rules section over here, like I mentioned, this is all of the standard logic, escalation, instacal, auto assign, auto field, maybe a few others that I'm missing there, are all handled by those business rules. So once the Amigo process is run, you come into your items, you verify everything, you verify your forms, your fields, workflows. I didn't create one, but I don't know if I had one to begin with. You then have to configure your UI. So like I mentioned, there's no user interface built in to version 11. So there's nothing for the Amigo tools to do. So you do have to come into your portal and consoles management and build your environment. And you're usually going to build a separate UI for each type of user you have. So if you have a service desk agent and a service desk customer, you're building two different UIs. If you have a service desk agent and a service desk manager and a service desk customer and a service desk customer number 2, then you're maybe building 4 UIs. And of course, if you have service desk and change and HR and facilities, then you're building more UIs. The number of which is going to depend, there's no exact formula for calculating. It really depends on how you're using the system. Okay, lastly is the Footprints Advanced Starter template. So for that, I'm going to go over to this environment here. And when you start with the Footprints Advanced Starter template, it's sort of similar to starting with the out of the box in that generally we just, we don't do the Amigo approach. We don't transition any data, of course, unless you really need to. But it's kind of like starting from scratch. So the beauty is very easy to set up. And out of the box, you get all these workspaces already set up. And for example, if I go into the service desk one here, you'll see I have different items. So whereas in version 11, this might have been 3 separate workspaces, or more likely a single workspace with just a drop-down field that says, which one it is, or a drop-down for these 2, and this would have been your global tickets. And of course, survey is a separate workspace. So now they're all in here. They're all easily related to one another. And if I go and show you incident, for example, your forms already configured, both the agent and the customer form. You can see all the sort of the fields and sections over here, similar to what Amigo would have done, but of course Amigo takes what you design, whereas this design here is sort of industry standard. And then business logic, for example. So this is, I would like to kind of show off this part here because just to show you the sheer number of rules here in Incident. There's over, I think, about 120 rules in here. And this is not overly a complex environment from the usability standpoint, but that is something that you're going to have to juggle with, right? You either have a simple front end, which means a complex back end, in terms of like usability versus administration, or the other way around. So you can see all the workflow, all the rules here. We have workflows defined, some templates, life cycles. And for all the different containers already done. So if you're just looking for, hey, I want a standardized approach to ITSM, this is a great place to start. And I think that pretty much concludes the presentation that I had. So I'm going to quickly look over sort of the chat and the Q&A, see if there's anything there. If you have any questions, by the way, please feel free to put them in, and we'll get to them. No, we had one question come in, but it's already been addressed. New one came in. Dean, how are attachments handled? So I don't know if you want to clarify that one for me, Dean, but essentially, so attachments Attachments and configuration are handled quite differently. And thank you for asking, because I feel like I should have mentioned that. So you might be used to, if I go back over to this VM here where I had version 11, if I go to like where version 11 is installed here, FootPrints version 11, FootPrints 11 and prior was very unusual in the way its configurations were handled. We're sort of used to, in these types of applications, you have the application files and then you have the database, and all of your configurations and your data resides in the database. Version 11 didn't work that way. Much of your configuration was in the file system, and much of your data was strewn across both. And I forget exactly where, I think is it under HTML? No, I forget exactly where the logic is. DB here. So every time I create a new container, a new workspace, for example, there's a separate set of files with all the configurations here. That doesn't exist anymore. All of this is in the database. Attachments are the exceptions. Attachments are still handled in a similar way where the attachments are on the file system. But attachments are handled through a third-party integration that BMC leveraged with Apache called Jackrabbit. And so if I go to like the current, install of FootPrints is over here, I go into repository, and then I can see my attachments over here. And I'm just going to pick one at random here. I have no idea what this file is here, but this is an attachment. Now, these files are not encrypted, but they are hashed. So, I can open this up with Notepad and have an idea of what this is. It's probably, it's an image, it's PNG. So they're hashed in this way so that FootPrints can easily identify if an attachment has already been added to a ticket. This is very useful for signature block images, right? Instead of constantly reattaching signature block images and then your attachment repository, gets really, really, really big. Here, oops. So there's whatever that file was, a little icon here. It hashes them this way, and so if it detects that, well, this file has already been attached once, it won't attach the physical file a second time, but of course it will reference it to the appropriate ticket. So I don't know if that answers your question, Dean, or if you had a different question for that, but if it was different, please clarify. Any other questions? So our attachments migrated from the old to the new. So if you are using the Amigo tools, if you saw when I ran the export tool, and I'll fire it up here again, when you run the export tool, you do have the option to bring over the data or just the configuration. If you bring over the data, it brings over the attachments as well. Other questions? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the webinar going for a few more minutes in case any last minute questions come up, but pretty much going to end it here. So thank you very much for joining. I hope you found the contents here informative. If you would like to reach out to us, or for that matter, you can reach out to BMC Direct, but I'll just kind of pull this back up here. So this is my contact information right there. You can shoot me an email if you've got any questions. We also have, I should have done this earlier. Let me pull it up here on screen. We've presented this before, but we have made sort of a chart comparing the different ways that you can transition here. I'm just going to pull this up real quick. On screen, and then where is it? Over here and over here. No, stop. So I'm just going to pull this up on screen, and if you'd like a copy of this chart, again, you can email me, and I'm more than happy to send it to you. Resume. Okay, so there it is. So this is not an official BMC document. I talked with BMC in the past, and they essentially said they didn't have a comparison chart for us. So we created one. sort of enumerating a lot of the information about the 3 different approaches. So if you'd like a copy of that, please feel free to email me or email BMC, your account manager, and they can get you a copy of this.
Yeah, thanks for joining everybody. Again, this is Brian Berger. And just to wrap up, do feel free to contact RJR directly. They'd be happy to help. And the invite for today's demo you should have received from your FootPrints account manager at BMC. Of course, you can always reach out to them with questions as well.
And
thanks for your time.
Thanks, Brian. I just got one last question here from Tom about moving from Linux to Windows. So if you're moving, from Linux to Windows, if you're doing the out-of-the-box approach, it really doesn't matter what you were doing before, because of course it's built from the ground up. With Fast, it's fairly similar. Usually the criteria there is going to be around data migration. And of course, it's kind of enumerated here. Usually not an issue. If you're doing Amigo, I'd take this with a grain of salt, because I don't remember this for 100%, but I believe the Amigo tools are available equally for Windows and Linux, and it does not matter, from what to what. But I would have to validate that. I don't remember that. Okay, and sorry, just I'm gonna pull up my contact info screen again here. Someone just there we go.